The Bloody Years, the bloodiest war in the history of mankind. War is a part of social, political, and cultural life that hardly any civilization can avoid. While war demonstrates a kind of savagery and cruelty of human nature, it also stimulates technological progress and promotes geographical expansion. Below, we will delve into 10 wars that changed the course of history. 1. The conquest of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's conquest drew the curtain like lightning across the night sky, brief and dazzling. He was the young king of Macedonia and his name was Alexander. He was steeped in war and his vast knowledge encompassed philosophy, history, and military science. His dreams were far-reaching and wild, and he longed to conquer the world. The cause of the conquest was to fulfill the unfulfilled ambitions of his father, Philip II. It was a collision of East and West, the product of a clash of civilizations. Since Alexander's accession to the throne in 336 BC, his campaign began with the Greek city-states that freed Macedonia, and his armies quickly raced under his leadership. However, as the so-called enlightened ruler, Alexander destroyed all voices of resistance in the land beneath his feet. His army gathered in the marketplace. Currency, gold, silver, and food were confiscated for military operations. His soldiers brought not only war, but terror, provoked riots and massacres. Alexander the Great's conquest had reduced one city to rubble, the seaside city called Tyrol. He spent countless lives piling up the mounds leading up to the city just to attack it. In the beginning, Alexander the Great's conquest journey began in the Kingdom of Macedonia. He led his army eastward, conquered the confederation of Greek city-states, and unified Greece. Next, he launched an attack on the Persian Empire, which was one of his most important campaigns. Alexander the Great's army showed amazing fighting prowess in the fierce battles against the Persian army. He adopted an aggressive offensive strategy and quickly captured many of the important cities of the Persian Empire. However, in the course of his conquest, Alexander the Great also showed a brutal side. After capturing Persian cities, Alexander the Great often retaliated by bloodying and destroying cities that resisted. Their ruthless tactics left them with countless war crimes in their wake. Every city they stormed was invariably covered in a storm of killing, raping, and looting. Terror and bloodshed became the norm in the cities wherever the Macedonian army went. Their system of invasion was not just about attacking military installations or confronting soldiers, but about the mass brutal slaughter of innocent civilians. In the city of Tyrol, the local citizens had no choice but to surround themselves inside the city walls to resist in the face of the defenseless siege by the Macedonian army. However, they were unable to stop the Macedonian army's attack, and those heartless soldiers, after breaking the city, committed the unconscionable fire and massacre of the people of Tyrol in broad daylight. And after the massacre, the atrocities showed no sign of stopping. Looting and destruction continued to accompany the Macedonian army's advance. During the military campaigns in Asia, Alexander's soldiers plundered the conquered cities with unparalleled fervor. Artistic treasures, endless wealth, and stores of supplies were ransacked by them. Even more distressing was the fact that rape became a regular feature of his army's campaigns. It is often said that war destroys humanity, yet in Alexander the Great's conquests, it could well be said that it was worse than war. Women like the women of Persia, that poor young girls, endured indescribable suffering and fear. Alexander the Great's conquests not only brought about brutal conditions, but also had far-reaching results. The expansion of his conquests not only changed the political landscape of the conquered regions, but also brought about the spread and integration of Greek culture. He founded many new cities, named after Alexander, which became centers of Greek culture. Of course, these are not meant to proclaim the glory of Alexander the Great, but more to reveal the crimes that he covered up. Though he brought a brief period of prosperity, it did not cover up his trampling of humanity and those crimes of extreme cruelty. The results of the war were devastating, with cities reduced to rubble and fields to wasteland. However, this did not stop the young archon from galloping. His dreams were still wild, his armies still marched on. Yet behind all this splendor, all that was seen was the gorgeous white bones on the other side that did not speak. The journey ended in Babylon, an empire forged in tears and blood. However, Alexander the Great's conquest eventually led to his own tragedy. During the long campaign, his army experienced fatigue and disease, and he himself suffered from injuries and illness. Eventually, Alexander the Great died in Babylon and his empire soon fell apart. 2. The Punic Wars of the Roman Empire. Once upon a time, by the Mediterranean Sea, two mighty empires faced each other like lions, their eyes cold and fierce, their bodies strong and scarred. One was the Roman Empire, the ambitious city that finally took up the baton of history, and the other was Carthage, the commercial powerhouse that had made the sea its home and was famous the world over. They were parting brothers and unavoidable enemies. When the drums of war roared among their hearts, the Punic War opened like the falling of stars and the touching of the moon to extinction. The Punic War was a bloody and brutal war in the history of the Roman Empire. The beginning of the war originated from the territorial rivalry at that time, and from the ambitions and desires of the two empires. The fight between Rome and Carthage reached a new stage of intensification. They fought over Sicily, the pearl of the earth and the key to controlling the entire Mediterranean. And the rebellion of Messina, a Carthaginian colony on Sicily, was the spark that started the war. It all started with greed, but ended in blood and fire. First, let's go back to the time when the Roman Empire was a large and powerful empire, ruling over vast territories and diverse peoples. However, its hold on North Africa was challenged, especially by resistance from the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians were a brave and proud North African tribe who inhabited the area that is now Tunisia. They were unwilling to accept Roman rule and therefore fought against the expanding forces of the Roman Empire. This became the trigger for the Punic Wars. The atrocious situation of the Punic War was the barbaric behavior of the armies on both sides. The Roman armies resorted to brutal strategies and tactics in order to conquer the Carthaginians. They carried out massive massacres of the resisting Carthaginian cities, showing no mercy to men, women, and children. The streets and squares of the cities were littered with the corpses of innocent civilians, and wails and screams filled the entire area. In addition to the mass killings, the Roman army resorted to cruel punishments and abuses. Captives and captive Carthaginians were held in deplorable conditions, tortured and tormented. They were forced into hard labor, enslavement, and exploitation. This cruelty turned the lives of the Carthaginians into a nightmare as they suffered endless pain and suffering. The results of the Punic Wars were disastrous. Although the Carthaginians showed great courage and perseverance, they were ultimately unable to withstand the might of the Roman imperial army. Perhaps the biggest shock was the protracted nature of the war, which lasted a full 23 years. People's lives were altered, filled with struggle and pain. Farmland was abandoned. Childhood spent strolling the streets no longer existed, only the fear of war and endless death. Their cities were razed to the ground, their culture and traditions destroyed. Forced into submission to the Roman Empire, the Carthaginians lost their freedom and dignity. The freestanding columns at the site symbolize mourning, a story told for the countless lives lost. Although Rome ultimately won the battle, they paid a heavy price. They won hegemony over the Mediterranean and ushered in the golden age of Rome. And those heroic lamentations that have been passed down to this day remind us not to forget that behind every victory is the baptism of blood and tears, endless suffering and sacrifice. 3. The Conquest of the Mongol Empire. The conquest of the Mongol Empire is an epic story full of bloodshed and brutality in world history. It was born out of Genghis Khan's ambition and desire for power, but it also reveals the barbaric and cruel side of mankind. Let's go back to the beginning of the 13th century, when the Mongol Empire was a vast and powerful empire that ruled over vast steppes and multiple ethnic groups. However, Genghis Khan was not satisfied with this. He longed to conquer more lands and people and bring the whole world under his control. Genghis Khan launched a series of conquests. His army swept in like a storm, ruthlessly crushing everything in their path. Their primary targets were the regions of Western Asia and Europe. The brutality of the Mongol armies lay in their strategy and tactics. They adopted a tactic called flying arrows, moving quickly and attacking at long range with powerful archers. This tactic was too much for the enemy to resist, and many cities and armies crumbled under the rain of Mongol arrows and were forced to surrender or were completely destroyed. As the Mongol armies conquered, they brought great destruction and death. They carried out massive massacres of the cities they conquered, showing no mercy to men, women, and children. Entire cities were burned, Streets and squares were littered with the bodies of innocent civilians, and wails and screams echoed throughout the region. In addition to massacres, the Mongol army resorted to acts of plunder and enslavement. They looted wealth, artifacts, and resources, burned buildings, and plundered farmland and livestock. People in conquered areas were forced into slavery or to pay heavy ransoms to keep their lives and property. The results of the Mongol Empire's conquest were disastrous. Countless cities were razed to the ground and civilizations and cultures were destroyed. The conquered people lost their freedom and dignity, and their lives were reduced to ruins. Entire regions were forced to submit to the Mongol Empire, and their destinies were changed forever. Genghis Khan's conquest lasted until the early 13th century, and his reign lasted more than 20 years, with many wars and killings. Since there was no comprehensive census or record-keeping system in those days, there are conflicting estimates of how many people died as a result of his campaigns. One relatively widely accepted estimate is that his conquests may have resulted in the deaths of between 40 and 60 million people, which is almost one-tenth of the world's population at the time. In some areas, such as Khorasan, after a year-long offensive, once thriving cities were now in ruins, their inhabitants slaughtered. When the war stopped, the world became cold and empty. After the conquest, only the seeds of brutality and suffering took root in the heart. Even though the Mongol Empire reached an unprecedented expanse, including parts of Europe and much of Central and East Asia, behind it all were countless human lives taken by merciless wars and massacres. The rulers of the Mongol Empire extended their hand to all corners of the world just to unite all people under their rule. Although some people were committed to maintaining peace and were also active in cultural and technological exchanges, the traces of blood and tears could not be washed away. It was a war that shook the world, deeply altering human history and changing the order of the world. And all this originated from the misty Mongolian plateau. 4. The Crusades. The Crusades was a bloody and brutal religious war in medieval history. It arose out of Christendom's desire for Jerusalem and its dissatisfaction with the rule of Islam, and at the same time revealed the faith and savagery of mankind. Let's go back to the end of the 11th century, when the Crusades were a series of wars waged to recapture the Holy Land of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which Christians believed to be the holy site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, was ruled by the Saladin dynasty of Islam. This inspired anger in Christendom and a desire to return to the Holy Land. The brutal circumstances of the Crusades lay in religious hatred and the barbaric use of military means. The Christian Crusader armies carried out massive massacres of Muslim and Jewish cities, showing no mercy to men, women, and children. They used religion as an excuse to treat their enemies as heretics, believing that slaughtering them was an act of devotion to God. In the course of their conquests, the Crusader armies also resorted to acts of plunder and slavery. They looted wealth and treasures, burned buildings, and plundered farmland and riches. The people of the conquered areas were forced into slavery or to pay high ransoms to protect their lives and property. As the light of dawn spread over Beirut, the city of hope turned to death. The cries inside the city and the wild laughter outside made a cold picture. They, in the name of God, bathed in the blood of innocence, greed and wantonness overshadowing what they claimed to be holy. Bonfires were lit at night, and under the light of those fires, dark shadows laughed, sang, drank, celebrated. The city, on the other hand, was devastated, with death and fear hovering in every corner, and countless people bidding farewell to the world in sorrow. The brutality was not only directed against the enemy, but also spread to their own people. Divisions and conflicts within the Crusades led to massacres and atrocities against each other by different factions. The struggle for power and wealth made the ranks of the Crusaders chaotic and disorganized, leading to more death and destruction. The results of the Crusades were disastrous. Although the Crusaders had some victories during certain periods, they ultimately failed to retake Jerusalem. The war brought great destruction and death, and the entire region suffered a long period of war and misery. Religious hatred and brutality led to a profound conflict between Christianity and Islam, with far-reaching consequences for the world's historical and religious landscape. The story of the Crusades is an epic of bloodshed and brutality that reveals the faith and savagery of mankind. The war wreaked havoc and damage on entire regions and peoples, and it changed the course of world history. The story is a reminder that there is no escaping the cruelty and suffering brought about by religious hatred and war, which has far-reaching consequences for individuals and societies. 5. The Hundred Years' War. In medieval Europe, the strife between the two great powers, England and France, was like a volcano about to erupt, which finally erupted in 1337, giving rise to the famous Hundred Years' War in history. The war was like a long-lasting flame that burned from the 14th century to the 15th century, with many ups and downs and several generations until 1453, when it drew to a close. The trigger for the Hundred Years' War came from the struggle for the thrones of England and France. At the time, King Charles IV of France was without an heir, just as Edward III of England, who happened to be Charles IV's nephew, believed he had the right to succeed to the French throne. However, the French nobles elected Philip VI as their king, which aroused Edward's desire to get his hands on French territory, thus triggering the war. The brutality of the Hundred Years' War was due to its duration and the barbaric use of military means. The war lasted for 116 long years, during which many battles and conflicts took place. The armies of both sides fought fiercely on the battlefields, and both the sieges and field conflicts were full of bloodshed and cruelty. When the city was besieged and captured, both the English and French armies acted with cruelty. The inhabitants of the city were subjected to mass slaughter, rape, and looting. The battles on the battlefield were also filled with bloodshed and death, with countless soldiers losing their lives and their bodies covering the entire battlefield. As the war continued, the people also suffered greatly. They were conscripted into the army and forced to take part in battles. Whether they were defenders in the cities or militia in the countryside, they were burdened with great pressure and risk. On top of that, the people endured the economic devastation and food shortages brought on by the war, which led to the spread of famine and disease. The results of the Hundred Years' War were disastrous. Although both sides had some victories in the war, there was no clear winner of the war. The war led to the exhaustion and weakening of both France and England, and the entire region was thrown into chaos and turmoil. The people made great sacrifices, whether it was lives, property, or hopes, that were destroyed by the war. The story of the Hundred Years' War is a long and brutal epic that reveals the absurdity of war and the suffering of the people. The war wreaked havoc and damage on the entire region and its people. It changed the fate of the country and the lives of the people. The story reminds us that there is no escaping the cruelty and suffering that war brings, and that it has far-reaching consequences for individuals and societies. 6. The Assyro-Babylonian War. The past is like a mirror, reflecting the time of the past, and the period from the 8th century to the 6th century BC is like a rusty bronze mirror, which records the Assyro-Babylonian Wars through the soot of history. The Assyro-Babylonian War was a bloody and brutal history in the ancient Middle East. The war, which took place between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, saw the Assyrian Empire brutally subjugate the Babylonians, cities destroyed, and mass slaughter and pillaging became the norm. Let's look at the details of this story. The cause stemmed from the Assyrian Empire's desire for the territory of Babylon, a land of fertile farmland and well-developed cities, a source of gold and precious stones to which the Assyrians aspired. Assyria, the most powerful empire of its time, decided to devour Babylon, their eyes like fierce lions on the spoils of war, and the trumpet of war preparations was blown. The brutal circumstances of the Assyrian Empire's war of conquest lay in their barbaric behavior toward the cities and inhabitants of Babylon. When the Assyrian army attacked Babylon, the city's defenses were quickly breached, and the Assyrian soldiers poured into the streets and squares of the city in a horrific massacre and pillage. The inhabitants of Babylon suffered greatly. The Assyrian soldiers slaughtered the innocent citizens without mercy, and no one was spared, neither the old, nor the women, nor the children. The streets and houses of the city were filled with misery, and the bodies of the inhabitants were strewn everywhere. Looting was also a common behavior in the Assyrian Empire's wars of conquest. Assyrian soldiers looted Babylon's wealth, including gold, precious stones, works of art, and valuable artifacts. They vandalized buildings and temples and robbed Babylon of its cultural heritage. At the end of the war, the Assyrian Empire brought Babylon under their rule. The prosperity and civilization of Babylon was greatly damaged and became a vassal of the Assyrian Empire. Although the Assyrian Empire held the wealth and resources of Babylon, the whole region fell into turmoil and decline. The story of the Assyrian-Babylonian War is a shocking one. It reveals the brutality of war and the ambitions of the conquerors, but it also shows the collapse of Babylonian civilization and the destruction of the entire region. The story reminds us that there is no avoiding the suffering that comes with war and conquest, and that it has far-reaching consequences for individuals and societies. 7. Athens-Spartan War. The Athens-Spartan War was a long conflict filled with bloodshed and brutality in the history of ancient Greece. The war, which took place between 431 and 404 BC, involved a confrontation between two powerful Greek city-states and included brutal battles, massacres, and war crimes. Let's dive into the details of this story. During that era, Athens was a center of culture and democracy, while Sparta was known for its military might and strict social system. Discord between the two city-states led to a long period of tension that eventually erupted into this war. The beginning of the war was filled with brutal battles. The armies of Athens and Sparta fought against each other on land and sea. Soldiers in battle fought each other in physical combat with spears, shields, and sword blades. The battlefield was a horrific sight, with blood staining the ground and screams and death moans echoing through the air. In this war, slaughter became the norm. The armies of both sides displayed merciless brutality in their attacks and defenses. Cities and villages were ransacked and innocent citizens suffered inhumane massacres. Women, children, and the elderly were not spared and were brutally killed or enslaved. War crimes were also widespread in this conflict. The brutal circumstances of the war led to a moral and ethical breakdown. Atrocities and human rights violations were committed by people on both sides of the military. Captives were abused, tortured, and enslaved, and prisoner of war camps became hell on earth. Innocent civilians also became victims of war crimes and were raped, robbed, and tortured. The outcome of the war had a profound effect on both city-states. Although Athens had some important victories in the early part of the war, eventually Sparta was victorious and imposed a harsh rule over Athens. The war led to unrest and weakening throughout Greece, as well as the decline of the Greek city-state system. The story of the Athens-Spartan War is full of thrilling episodes. It reveals the brutality of war and the ambitions of the conquerors, but also shows the dark side of human nature and the destruction of individuals and society by war. The story reminds us that war cannot be avoided, but we should strive for peace and reconciliation to prevent mankind from being plunged into endless suffering. 8. Roman-Gaulish War. The Roman-Gaulish War was a bloody and destructive war in the history of ancient Rome. The war took place between 58 and 50 BC and involved the conquest of Gaul by the Roman Empire, which included massive battles, massacres, and destruction of cities. Let's delve into the details of this story. During that time, the Roman Empire was one of the most powerful empires in the world, while Gaul was a rich and independent place ruled by Celtic tribes. Caesar, the leader of the Roman Empire, was eager to bring Gaul under their rule and launch this war of conquest. The beginning of the war was filled with massive battles. The Roman army fought to the death against the warriors of the Gallic tribes. The Roman soldiers were well-equipped and disciplined, while the Gaulish warriors were known for their bravery and fanaticism. On the battlefield, spears and sword blades met, the sound of shields clashing echoed in the air, and the cries of soldiers from both sides were intertwined with the neighing of war horses. Massacres became a common sight in this war. The Roman army mercilessly slaughtered the inhabitants of the Gallic tribes in sieges or encounters. No man, woman, or child was spared. Towns and villages were ransacked, blood was spilled, and screams and cries filled the region. The destruction of cities was also a regular feature of the war. Roman armies captured the cities of Gaul and razed them to the ground. Houses were engulfed in flames and downtown areas were reduced to rubble. The city's temples, palaces, and cultural monuments were destroyed, and Gaul's prosperity and civilization suffered a huge blow. The result of the war was the conquest of Gaul by the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar succeeded in bringing Gaul under Roman rule and establishing the Roman system of rule. The independence and autonomy of the Gallic tribes disappeared, and they became part of the Roman Empire. Although the Roman Empire gained wealth and resources, the people of Gaul paid a great price. The story of the Roman-Gaulish War is full of glory and tragedy. It reveals the brutality of war and the ambitions of the conquerors, while showing the destruction of the Gallic civilization and the transformation of the entire region. The story reminds us that there is no avoiding the suffering brought about by war, and that it has far-reaching consequences for both individuals and societies. At the same time, it makes us think about and cherish the importance of peace in order to avoid repeating the mistakes of war. 9. War of Aggression in the State of Córdoba. The State of Córdoba, in those bygone years, was a name that was celebrated and symbolized a place of prosperity, learning, and brotherhood. However, with the passage of time, the State of Córdoba gradually transformed from a peaceful paradise to a greedy empire whose leaders, lost in the lust for power, launched a devastating war of aggression. That phase became a page of history, a dark era that people cannot forget. The cause was simple, mixed with jealousy of power and greed. The leaders of the State of Córdoba looked at the smaller states around them and salivated at their wealth and prosperity. The deeper fear was that if they were not eliminated, they would become a threat that could plague the prosperity of the State of Córdoba. Then the drums of war shook the region, and the armies of Córdoba began their journey. Imagine those brutal battlefields, filled with smoke, fire, and broken screams. Magnificent cities and innocent countryside were reduced to rubble overnight. The armies of Córdoba destroyed everything that stood in their way with astonishing force and without mercy, killing, looting, destroying, and then rejoicing in their victory in the night. The results of the war were magnificent, but also hollow. The State of Córdoba gained new territory and great wealth in their conquests, yet they also lost much. They lost the camaraderie they once had as well as the respect of their people, which faded in the clamor of the conquest. The leaders of Córdoba looked at the fruits of their victory and then laughed bitterly, for they had given so much and all they had gotten was ruins and the fear of their people. That war of aggression in the State of Córdoba was a tragic page in history. It showed the nastiness of human nature, the illusion of power, and the evils of war. That story of brutality, violence, and chaos, and the pain and loss of that period of history, will remind us of this bitter lesson. 10. The 30 Years' War. In the annals of history, the 30 years between 1618 and 1648, like a darkened mirror reflecting the deep religious and political rifts among the nations of Europe, is the brutal chapter of the 30 Years' War, which changed that era and changed the world. The story begins in 1618 in the castle of Prague, Bohemia. A dispute between a nobleman loyal to Catholicism and a nobleman in favor of Protestantism escalates the conflict between religious beliefs and political interests, triggering a series of violent incidents. This small spark ignites the whole of Europe, and the war spreads, involving every country. The first phase of the war was the Window of Prague incident, which became a symbol of the 30 Years' War. At that time, a group of angry Protestants threw two Catholic leaders out of the windows of Prague Castle, sparking a full-blown conflict. This incident symbolized the hostility and antagonism of religious beliefs that became the trigger for the war. The roots of such a war came from all corners of Europe: popes and clergy, dukes and kings, merchants and peasants, each playing their part in it. They had their own beliefs, and faith became the determination that kept them grounded and the source of their inability to compromise. When political division met religious conflict, the smoke of war began to fill the skies of Europe. As the wars escalated, the scenes of brutality became more diverse and horrific. In the German region, a series of battles were fought between Protestants and Catholics. Villages were sacked, cities besieged, and civilians innocently slaughtered. There was often no mercy on either side of the war, and massacres, rapes, and looting became the order of the day. Famine and disease were also frequent visitors to war. Warfare left farmland abandoned and farmers fleeing their homes, leading to massive food shortages and famine. People starved, diseases spread rapidly, and hunger and disease claimed countless lives. Famine became a companion to war, making people's lives even more difficult. The brutality of war also had a relentless destructive power. Cities were overrun and destroyed, buildings were gutted by artillery fire, and people were left homeless. Cultural and artistic legacies were destroyed and the memory of history erased. The war brought prolonged devastation and struggle to the European continent, and people's lives were turned upside down. Eventually, after 30 years of brutal war, the nations of Europe grew tired of the destruction and suffering of war. In the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the parties reached a settlement that brought the war to an end. However, the wounds left by the 30 Years' War took a long time to heal, and the landscape of Europe changed profoundly as a result. The 30 Years' War was one of the most brutal and devastating wars in European history. It not only brought about a huge humanitarian disaster, but also changed the national and political landscape of Europe. This dark and bloody history is forever etched in people's memories, warning us of the terrible consequences and importance of war. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.